Well, I'm so excited to be here and enthusiastic about this class, which, as you know, is called God and Science. And this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, and now I finally have an opportunity to share some ideas that have been percolating. The class is going to go for 6 weeks, and this first session is going to be an overview, and you'll see throughout the course of it, and my style of teaching tends to have things interweave back on each other, so I'm going to open up some broad areas that we're going to cover today, and during the course of the other classes we're going to weave back through them. So the overall theme for this class is the ways in which mysticism and science have commonalities, and also the ways in which the understanding of the universe at different times in history have had a lot to do with what the notion of God was at a particular era, and furthermore, how our current ways of thinking about God perhaps are still back in the ways that people thought about God several hundred years ago, because there's a tendency with any kind of organization, which includes organized religion, to take a while to catch up on paradigm shifts in thinking and consciousness. So I hope during the course of these classes you'll allow yourself to perhaps go through one or more paradigm shifts and questionings and revisings of the way that you think about God. And I was thinking recently how those of us that keep up with software in our computers, oh, there's a new update for this software, better update this, or there's a better operating system, better do that. But we don't think about updating our operating system or our vantage point for spirituality all that often. So that's what I'm going to encourage you in and challenge you in during the course of these classes. So let's go back thousands of years to the times of the yogis in ancient India. Well, they didn't have laboratories, and they didn't have grants from the National Institutes of Health, and they didn't have books written down about subtle anatomy, but like humans have been throughout history, they were curious, and they wanted to know about how the universe worked, and they wanted to know about how human beings worked. And so they began exploring in their meditations. And what did they explore? Well, they explored inner realms. They explored and discovered that there's subtle nerve centers in their bodies, and they even mapped out, these diagrams of these nerve plexes and ways that energy flow that later have been established through systems such as acupuncture. But their research tool was their own consciousness. And they worked with the effects of different sounds on consciousness, which in India were called mantras. And in that time, the outer world, well, the yogis withdrew from it. They were living in the jungle or in caves, so they were much more interested in inner realms. And they discovered ways to link up with what we could call transcendent reality, or the beyond manifestation aspect of reality, and achieve states of consciousness called samadhi. And the ultimate goal in yoga was to merge in cosmic consciousness, to dissolve the sense of personal identity. So the notions of God then were, even if there was a personal aspect of God in manifestation, that wasn't the good stuff. The good stuff was to go beyond everything and dissolve what it meant to be a human being and just merge in eternal bliss. Well, that's one aspect of what we might think of as the divine, but the fact that we're all sitting here suggests that, well, we don't think that that must be the ultimate purpose, because here we are living in the world. And then throughout history, the notions of what the universe was about have changed many times. The ancient Greeks thinking there were these perfect spheres, and there were unchanging archetypes, and Plato's metaphor of the cave and the true reality was like what the people in the cave, which was most of humanity, perceived as just the shadows of a truer existence, which was perfect and beyond change. And we wind the clock ahead more, and we get the theory that the Earth was the center of the solar system and everything revolved around the Earth. And then along comes Copernicus and Galileo going, well, no, it isn't like that. But of course there was, you could say, a little bit of resistance to those ideas. They were persecuted and branded as heretics and had to renounce what they had to say. But then it took some time for the world to catch up with, well, I guess it really is like this. So now we know, no, everything revolves around the sun. And so throughout this, there have been different notions about what the universe is like, and even about what creation is like. So in ancient times, some of the Greeks thought that the universe had existed forever. There wasn't a beginning point of creation. And then there came the notion, well, there was this deity, this God that brought forth creation, the story in Genesis and other mystical traditions about how creation came into being, that there was a starting point. And then there's different models in different spiritual systems about, well, what happens in that existence. And what goes with that is what the God is like in that existence. So in some models of the universe is static and unchanging. I mean, it's just there, whether it had a created point or whether it's always been there, it just stays. And so this goes with a notion of God that is static and unchanging. So this is the God that in some systems either actively participates in existence, or in other belief systems, well, there is this God, but God's really beyond it all and kind of leaves the beings in existence to find their way to get back to where they're supposed to be. Well, then we've discovered other things in science and other models about what the universe is like. In one model that until recently was pretty much accepted, there was the Big Bang, but then after a very long period of time there's going to be the Big Crunch. The universe expands, and then gravitational forces pull everything back, and then it's kind of back to the drawing board all over again. Well, this model goes with the traditional ways of thinking about the Hindu deities. There's Brahma, there's Vishnu, there's Shiva. Brahma's the creator, Vishnu's the preserver, and Shiva's the destroyer. And in the scriptures of Hinduism, its existence is described as Maya. It's illusory, and that just means it's transitory. It doesn't have a permanence to it, and it's all the play of God. So there's the creation, the preserving, the destruction, and then God goes to sleep for a very long period of time. And then the show starts all over again, but it's back to the drawing board. I mean, it starts from square one. There's nothing that's carried over from the previous existence. And there's something that never seemed quite right to me about that. It's like, well, for one, we're into the environment and recycling, and what a waste to take all this gain from billions and billions of years of existence and consciousness, and then it's just wiped out again, and it starts all over again. And it also raises questions, if you are familiar with some aspects of contemporary cosmology and physics. There's this mystery about why the constants that are used in physics had to be so precise, and sometimes to like 14 decimal points. And if it had been any different, there couldn't have been a universe in which life could have existed. And some people go, well, this was just random luck of the draw, because if it had been different, we wouldn't be here to ponder such things. But if you think about the chances of that just happening randomly, not just one constant, but a lot of the different constants, it's just inconceivable. So there's some contemporary theories of cosmology that say that if there was a Big Bang, which is pretty generally accepted, it wasn't the beginning of all of existence. It was just one of a perhaps countless number of universes that arose and evolved and then disappeared. The most current theory about our universe, it's known now that it's expanding and probably will keep expanding forever, and eventually even the protons will decay into subatomic particles. So in just unconceivable trillions of years in the future, there'll be nothing left but darkness and subatomic particles floating around. Well, that's a pretty bleak prospect, right? But some other cosmologists are theorizing that what can happen in a black hole, that the information that goes in doesn't disappear, but it emerges out of a white hole, which is something that's created, like a whole new universe can be created from the black hole. And if that's the case, all of the information, perhaps from our universe, eventually is going to be the seed of information for a new universe. And if that's the case, then that's an explanation of why these constants are the way that they are. They're the result of untold cycles of evolution, and these were the ones that worked, and so they go forth. So I hope as I'm saying some of these things, it's not so important that you get every concept that I'm saying, but I hope that your minds are starting to get boggled a little bit. All right, good. And don't worry, I'm going to come back to these ideas in the different weeks, and in fact, in the different weeks, I'm going to have an emphasis on like the mysticism of the Upanishads and the Big Bang Theory, and so on, with different systems, and the Zohar, the way it describes creation, and so on. So we're going to see ways that what the mystics have discovered in their meditations from a long time ago are consistent with what's being discovered in science currently, which is pretty amazing. But what the mystics have said, at least some of them have said, that there can't be two truths. You think about it, how can there be a truth of religion and a truth of science? And what many people have to do these days is when the teachings of the religion don't go with science, they just kind of find a way of compartmentalizing that. Well, this is just the religious part of things, and I'll just put on my religion hat here and get into this. And then when you leave, well, this is the science side, and just go, well, they just don't go together. There's science over here and there's mysticism over here. But I've been trying to keep up with a lot of books that people have written, and many books are coming out and have come out pretty recently about themes related to God and science, and giving an explanation of why attendance at churches across denominations has been dropping off big time. And it's not just Christian ones, that you go across the board. And I think one reason for that is people want things to make sense. And when they don't make sense, they may go, well, I guess I better try something else. And so there's a sense, well, I will be spiritual, but I guess I can't be religious because I can't find a way that religion fits with this. But a lot of the people writing these books are saying, well, religion is very important, and science is very important, and what's needed is a way of understanding that puts these together, where people can be able to have their rational way of understanding and the sense of mystery, and have things be cohesive and coherent. So this is one of the hopes I have with what you might get from this series of classes, and Diane will say a little bit at the end about what she's going to be doing on each Monday evening from 6 to 7 here on the days after these classes about practices related to this. What you'll get from these is a way of revising, challenging, updating your way about relating to whatever it is that you call God. And yesterday I was just curious, and so I Googled etymology of the word God. And basically what I found is at the time of the scriptures, when they were written, the term God was not used. It was a word that came into use much later. And there have been terms in different religions and mystical traditions about gods. But the current way of God, the etymology really has something to do with about a means of relationship or a means of experience. It was like an active term about the relationship, about the human to whatever they considered this mystery or this deeper source of meaning in existence. But the word God in our time has become very loaded for many people. And it's become generally an all or none proposition. Well, yes, I believe in God, and this is my experience. Or if someone's notion of God is based on the kind of the more common way that it's presented in scriptures as this separated being that intervenes in existence, and the Old Testament God, well, if I like what you're doing, you get reward, and if I don't, bad things happen to you, and so on. But this dualistic sense of God who can do things contrary to the laws of physics, well, for a lot of people that just, especially if they're scientifically inclined, well, I just can't buy that one. So religion is, no, there is no God. So I'm just getting off the boat here, and I'm going to pursue my own ways of looking at things. But one of the downsides that goes with that way of dealing with the problem is it oftentimes leads to a sense of, well, there's no meaningfulness in existence. It's just kind of random atoms bumping into each other and kind of dog-eat-dog evolution. There's no real purpose to anything. And if there's any order in things, well, it just happened to be that way. And it can lead to a real kind of feeling of isolation from the rest of existence, and a downplaying or an even turning off of that sense of mystery that I think is such an important aspect of being a human being. And so the word really doesn't make any difference. Diane and I were students in the Sufi order with Pir Vilayat, who was this great teacher, and instead of using God, because he recognized the problem with the connotations the word had, he would just use the universe with a capital U, or the cosmos with a capital C, this meaning more than just the physical universe that we can perceive with the senses. So one thing I'd like you to begin thinking about is when you think about the word God, what does that mean for you, and what does that do for you? And it's not that I'm saying, well, you should just get rid of the notion that there is a God, but maybe find a way of personalizing what that means for you, and you may even have a different term that you use to describe it. So I was thinking recently about why in many different religions there's so many different names of God, or gods, it seems like in Hinduism, I don't know how many there are. There might be 1,000 different gods. There's like the elephant god, and there's the monkey god, and there's the god of wisdom, and the god of prosperity, and the god of destruction, and so on. And looking at Hinduism from the outside, there's a tendency to think, oh, wow, this is ridiculous, and they think there's all these different ones. But these are all just different aspects of the same one being experienced and related to in a different form. So now I'm going to tell you a very familiar story, but perhaps with a little twist that you haven't heard the story quite this way before. And this is, you've heard the story about the blind men and the elephant, I'm sure. But this is the 5 blind philosophers and the elephant. So a king was very curious about what 5 blind philosophers who had never experienced an elephant would think the elephant was, and so he set up an appointment for them to visit him. But when they got there, his aide came out and says, I'm sorry, the king's going to be tied up for a while, but we'd like you to go to this room, and we've got something interesting for you to experience and discourse about. So they're in this room with this elephant, and they, the usual, it's a pillar, it's a rope, and so on. And after several hours, the king's aide comes in and hears the philosophers talking. And the aide said, well, gentlemen, I realize that each of you has just experienced a part of this creature, which we call an elephant, but really this is a whole creature, and this is what it's all about. And one of the philosophers interrupted and said, what could you possibly know? We've been discussing this for hours, and you just walked in. So the philosophers may not all be blind, but they've been discussing for hundreds and hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. And I think each different tradition and way of relating to whatever we call the divine, the transcendent, and so on, has a part of the picture, but it's pretty hard to find one that's really integrating the different perspectives, and that's why we have such conflicts between different religions, because no, we've got the truth here, no, it's this one over here. instead of realizing they're just experiencing different aspects of the same thing. So instead of thinking of God as something static up there, out there, that you're trying to somehow communicate with and relate to, what if you put a different word of your choice in there and think of what you had thought of God instead, that means a modality of relationship with the sacred, or a modality of relationship with the divine, or the mystery, or the transcendent. You can fill in the blank with whatever you want. But it's a way of relating to something. Well, if we're going to relate to something, we have to have some way that it makes some kind of sense. At least we hope so. And so how do we do that? Well, we usually start by referring to ways that we already understand things. Well, this is like this. God is like so-and-so and such and such. And then we might start to posit different questions. Well, I wonder if it could be like this or like this, and we adjust our way of thinking. Well, one way of describing that is we tinker with our metaphor. We all have metaphors of relating to the sacred. Okay? Because I think all the mystics have, however they describe God, have said that you can never be separate and have a full experience of whatever it is that you're thinking of God. And even in the scriptures, it says things like, "No man can see me and live." It just it's impossible. Well, I don't want to get into reasons why I think that's impossible, but just to say you can't have the full direct experience, but you can have an interaction with. So now imagine that you've never tried wine before, and someone gives you a glass of wine. And you take a sip, and they say, "Well, how would you describe this?" You might go, "Well, it's sweet. Well, it's kind of dry. It tastes like cherries," or this or that. And you probably have a few adjectives you could pick, but probably not a whole lot. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the documentary that's on Netflix about the training sommeliers have to go through. These are like the wine masters. And if you're going to be a master sommelier, it's insane what they have to do. I mean, they have to not only know the history of about thousands and thousands of wine, but their final test is they give them, I think, let's say 7 glasses of different wines, and they have to identify what wine, what vintage, what country, and what year the wine is from out of thousands and thousands and thousands. So they've got a pretty discriminating palate, right? Okay. So we don't have to go that far, but one of the aims I have for what it is that we're doing here is to help each of you move in the direction of becoming a connoisseur of the sacred, or a connoisseur of the divine. Well, what does that mean? So think about the ways that you have an experience of whatever it is that you call God. Well, we have words to describe it. I feel a presence, right? Or I feel an energy, or things seem more clear, or I sense light, or I feel my heart opening. And these are all wonderful and well and good, but these are just like a few of the flavors of the wine taster sampling the wine. So with development of our spiritual capacities, we can develop a very fine discrimination of many, many, many different aspects of what we thought was just kind of lumped as a generic something or other. And ask yourself if that might not be a nice thing to do. I mean, you think that would be a good thing to do? You'd have a much richer experience. So when the sommelier tastes a new wine, you can just imagine just all the things going through their sensory experience. Or a very well-trained musician who has a really good ear is listening to a symphony they've never heard before. Not just the themes going through the symphony they're picking up on, but the subtle nuances and the changes of tempo and so on. So they're going to have a much richer experience. Or an artist looking at someone else's art is probably going to see much more depth in that than someone who's not familiar with it. Oh, well, that's pretty, or that reminds me of such and such. So if we want to have richer experiences of things in the outer world, wouldn't it be nice to have much richer experiences of things in the inner world? And how can we do that in a way where it's consistent with some things that scientists are discovering. And I've said this before, but some of the things that scientists are discovering and publishing in things like Science News and Scientific American, if you had shown me these articles 20 years ago and didn't tell me where it came from, I'd say, well, what nut wrote this? I mean, they sound that crazy. So in Scientific American, there's been articles saying that, by very credible scientists, that both space and time are conditioned illusions of our dualistic perception of reality. That we collapse the true reality down into this holographic projection, and they say there's no way to tell the difference of, are we living in a four-dimensional holographic projection of a five-dimensional reality. It's impossible, if we were in that projection, to know whether we were in the projection or whether we were in the actual reality. It can't be done. So things that show that we think of time, well, okay, watch the clock, we start at this time, we're going to end at this time, and we are conditioned by everything to think of the arrow of time. The arrow of time goes from past, present, to future. It's one way, right? And this is just basic relativity. You don't have to read too much Einstein for the masses to understand this one, that time is dependent on a frame of reference. So in our particular frame of reference, time moves in a certain direction, but there could be another whole existence that is moving in a different direction where, to their perspective, we're going backwards in time. And to our perspective, they're going backwards in time. And you go, well, which one is right? Neither one is right. They're both relative vantage points. So we are beings existing in a relative vantage point in a much broader, multidimensional existence, and we are conditioned by our physical senses. Many people would say, if I can't see it, it's not real. If I can't touch it, it's not real. We're conditioned even more so by our patterns of thinking. Well, one pattern of thinking, and as I say this, you'll go, well, what do you mean pattern of thinking? That's the way it is, right? Is that the future can't change the past. So how many people think the future can change something that's already happened? Well, some of you that may have heard some of these stories. So I'll share just one of them, and I may come back to some of these when they go with the topic for the particular week, but some tidbits. So Diane and I met this man who used to be on the faculty of the Princeton Engineering Research Laboratory named Roger Nelson, and that lab continues to do experiments with random number generators. And all a random number generator is this little computer, and it won't do spreadsheets. All it does is crank out random numbers, and it records them. So pretty simple. You probably wouldn't want to trade your computer or your iPad for one of these. Wouldn't be too interesting. And so the first experiment, they would bring people into the lab and say, we'd like you to sit with this machine and see if you can alter its output so it's not random. Well, that sounds pretty impossible, right? But most people could do that by whatever means they did that. But more amazing than that, let's pretend that this is my lab and I've stored the data from yesterday, and Alan, I bring you in and I say, I'd like you to see if you can, nobody's looked at it, it hasn't been printed out, it's just sitting in the computer. I'd like you to see if you can alter the output from yesterday between 2 and 3 in the afternoon so it's not random. And sure enough, they'd bring people in, and then they would look at it and analyze it. That would be the only time of that day the data was not random. Now, your mind's getting boggled just a little bit here. That's impossible. Wait a minute. If it's on the computer and it's stored on the hard disk, it doesn't make any difference if somebody's looked at it, and it sure as heck can't be changed by some new age wacko coming into the laboratory and thinking that they can go like this and change the output, but it happens. Okay? Physicists have done many experiments, and I won't go into the details of these because it can get a little bit complicated, where they do something in the present and they can show that it changed what already happened, that had already been measured in the past. And so this really kind of shakes the foundations of our notion about time and causality. We think of causality, I pick something up, it drops, it's all a chain of events going into the future. But physicists talk about something called retrocausality, that the future can actually change events in the past. And so think that initially, here we are, human beings trying to understand our relationship to the deeper mystery and the rest of existence, and it's pretty much a given that we assume I'm this separate person here, and there's this mystery out there. I can't get to all of it, but I'd like to try to understand it, but I'm going to try to interact with it and do experiments with it and so on. But everything is just going to move from present to future, and I'm separated from what I'm experiencing and trying to analyze. Well, as we'll get into in later classes, quantum physics has shown so many times that the observer changes the output of what's being observed. There's no scientist in the white coat objectively measuring something without having an impact on it, that we do impact what we're experiencing. So now we have to come to a different way of, if we want to understand the deeper reality, instead of thinking of it in the Newtonian sense, and we'll come back to what Newtonian thinking has done, good and bad, at a different time. Instead of thinking that I'm separated from it and I'm objective, I'm in the midst of it, and what I do is going to be influencing it, and I'm totally interconnected with what I'm experiencing, and I'm not really separated from it, but I have a consciousness that enables me to focalize on this aspect in relationship to the rest of it. And now, how can I do science? Well, the quantum physicists are having to deal with that quandary, because that is what they find themselves in. There's research done by the Institute of Noetic Sciences. You may have heard of the two-slit experiment, where light behaves as either particle or wave, depending on how you set it up. Well, they put meditators in a totally separate laboratory at a distance, and they said, these are experienced meditators, we'd like you to imagine that you're in the laboratory and you're able to observe what happens with the photon when it goes through. And when they do that, the experiment behaves just as if the researcher was in the room doing something that forced the light to become a wave or a particle in nature. But if just someone who was not an experienced meditator, they gave them the same task, nothing happened. So even the consciousness of somebody at a distance can change what happens in this objective laboratory. Better have a different way of trying to understand what the universe is about. Okay, so let's shift gears to whatever it is that we think of as being God. So one model of trying to understand God is something separate from me, God is something distant. Sometimes I can get close and experience something that comes from God, but I'm really here. And this has a lot to do with what your aim of spirituality is. Is my aim, depending on the religion, to get saved, go to heaven, in Hinduism, or yoga, to become merged in the transcendent, in Buddhism, to get off the cycle of being and becoming, and so on. So what's your aim? And that's going to have a lot to do with how you relate to that. Well, if the aim is, well, we'd like to be in the world, we don't want religion or spirituality to take us away from life. In fact, we'd like for life to continue to be better. We'd like for it to be better for ourselves. We'd like for it to be better for our children and grandchildren. We'd like existence to move in a more and more positive direction. And so how do we have a relationship with what we think of as God that goes with that, as opposed to one in which either God is separated from us, or one in which the purpose is to get out of life and go someplace else better after you die? Well, that challenges us to revise the way that we think of it. Just like the scientist has to revise his or her way of thinking, knowing that they are totally interconnected with what it is they're trying to experience. If we want to understand spirituality and mystery, then what happens if we allow ourselves to operate from that? We're totally like the fish in the water trying to understand what water is. We're totally in the midst, and we are actually living manifestations of what it is that we're wanting to understand. How do we go about doing that? Well, on one level, we have to have some frame of reference or some kind of metaphor that enables us to navigate to where we want to go to. And what do we call what we're navigating on? We usually call it our spiritual path. And when we think of path, generally we think about, well, we're here and we have a destination over there and we want to go from A to B, and how are we going to get there, right? And if we go off the path, we want to go back on the path. But what if instead of that, we think about all of existence, including of what we think of as God, the divine, and just even the manifest and subtle levels of the universe are all on this never-ending journey towards moving towards greater and greater light and fulfillment. And amazingly enough, we can develop the capacity to consciously participate in that, and not just as a passive experiencer, oh, okay, I can see the wonders of this and that aspect of the divine being, but we're all unique aspects of the divine being that are waking up and developing the capacity to see where we want to go from here. Well, I don't know about for you, but to me that's much more exciting and fulfilling than to think about a spiritual journey as being something I'm doing for myself to get someplace. It's like everything is moving towards someplace, and we can develop ways that we can participate in that. So let me pause for a moment here and see if anybody has any questions about anything I've said so far.
So how does science show that we diminish our ego, our separate thinking of ourselves? Are there any ways in which to...
Okay, so I'm going to repeat the question since I'm recording it. How does science have ways to help us diminish our ego or ways of separate thinking of ourselves? And I would say in some spiritual traditions, there's these terms like annihilating the ego or shattering the ego, but that isn't the real ego. You know, I think we're here, we're each unique manifestations of this divine being, and we're not, in my book, trying to dissolve our uniqueness or our individuality, but it's a wonderful question. But we'd like to free ourselves from the illusion that we're separated from what it is that we're trying to experience. So how does science help with that? Well, one, all the research that shows that there are effects operating across distance from the future to the past. There was one study that was done where they gave some experienced healers just some names that had randomly been picked from people who had been hospitalized several years before, I think for different heart conditions. And they didn't tell them anything about the people. They said, just pray for these people. And then after the study was over, they looked at what happened with those people when they were in the hospital and afterwards. And the ones that were prayed for, and remember, this was years after they were out of the hospital, the ones that were prayed for had shorter hospitalization stays, and they had better, it wasn't statistically significant, but they had better outcomes compared to the ones that weren't prayed for. But these were already out of the hospital, and they'd been out for years. How can somebody pray in the future for something that's already happened? Well, the world, as scientists are discovering, is totally different than the way that we think it is. And the thinking is our conditioned thinking. So how does spirituality help with this? Well, there have been, I will call them technologies developed by different mystical traditions for thousands of years, and Diane's going to be getting into some specific practices on Monday nights that help us free ourselves from our conditioned vantage point. It's not that there's something wrong with having a sense of identity. That's a good thing, but the problem is when that way of thinking about our identity separates us from what it is that we're trying to experience. And so there are ways in different spiritual traditions to do that, very well-developed systems. I taught a class here several years ago I called Many Doorways to Awakening, and I said that the only prerequisite for coming was to at least be an open-minded skeptic. And what I meant for that, in all seriousness, was I want you to be skeptical, but I want you to be open to altering your assumptions about yourself and reality based on either your own experience or credible hard data from research. And it didn't take long to share some scientific studies and even some simple practices for the people in the class to go at least open the doors to, oh, I don't know what this energy I'm feeling here is, and just to start wondering about things. Well, maybe there's something more than the way I always thought that things were. So thank you for that question. Yes?
I was thinking of a thought experiment we might do as a group. We were talking about random number generators. There's a random number generator called the Mega Millions Lottery. Meditate on it. But we propose that in a prayerful way, we will use the Mega Millions as a group, decide how to use it for something really good, and see if we can hit the lottery.
Well, that's an interesting question. All concentrating on Mega Million numbers and see if we can win the lottery. But spirituality has some, like everything else, it has some fine print, and one of the fine print items is it doesn't work for horse races. Although once I had a client, I retired last year from my psychology practice, who told me about, and this is supposedly a true story of this woman that she knew in Flower Bluff, who had a dream in which she dreamed of her deceased mother who gave her some lottery numbers to pick, and she bought a ticket the next day and won $5 million. So you might try that with your dead relatives. I don't know. Yes, Rick.
I'm curious to know if you, in the weeks to come, if you're going to be relating how all this manifests itself in the medical community.
How this manifests in the medical community? Well, I'll say a little bit about that now. There are people called medical intuitives that are not like, corner psychics and tarot readings that well-established doctors and clinics even use sometimes for difficult cases. And the medical intuitive will tune into the person and be able to give insights to help the doctor arrive at a diagnosis without having necessarily any contact with that person. And Carolyn Mace, yes. And there's been a lot of research on distant healing. This has been for decades ago. UCLA, they had some kind of machine that could actually measure auras. It could measure the different frequencies, and they'd have, I think it was Carolyn Mace, that came there, and they'd ask her, what colors do you see around what parts of the body, and the machine would pick up the same thing. But this can be used in diagnosis, because a lot of times disorder arises in the realm of subtle energy of a person, and then it takes a while to get down into the nuts and bolts of their body, and if you can pick up a disorder on that level, sometimes there might be an intervention to keep it from getting full-blown. So Diane and I presented, I think it was in the mid-90s, at this conference, this group called the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energy and Subtle Energy Medicine, which, if you're interested, Google them. They now have their research journals online available for free, and they're amazing studies. Some of them are very well done, controlled studies showing effects of subtle energy and talking a lot about healing and theories of physicists about subtle energy and so on. So there's been more and more interest of people. The Institute of Noetic Sciences is also very good research. You can look on the research studies that they've done and very interesting results.
What was the name again of that?
Institute of Noetic Sciences, or if you just Google capital IONS, it's called IONS. Edgar Mitchell founded that. And they have some really interesting things. Other questions at this point?
Oh, Don. Regarding time and the concept of time, so the Big Bang Theory comes into play there, and so the universe, scientists are showing that the universe is ever expanding and not contracting. But might there be parallel universes that are contracting? In other words, going in another direction.
Well, there's different. Yeah, the question is, the Big Bang Theory says our universe. Well, the theory itself doesn't imply that our universe expands, but it's been discovered by research and theories about dark matter. And by the way, we only know what about 4% of the stuff of our universe really is. The rest is dark matter and dark energy. So you think after all these years of science, we could do better than 4%. I imagine there's some senators going, why are we funding this research? You know? This is in the margin of errors of the political polls. I mean, I don't know. So, I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, and there's theories. Well, one of the theories of physics is if I flip a coin and it comes up heads, that at that same instant there's a whole parallel universe that's created identical to this one, that it comes up tails. And every instant it splits, and I just cannot buy that. I mean, that to me is such a, well, I'll just be polite and say very strange way of thinking, and not a very good use of cosmic resources to be creating new universes every time you turn around. And then string theory is trying to find theory that reconciles gravity and quantum physics. And so one of the theories of string theory is that there are 10 to the 500th power different types of possible universes, of which ours is one. And in some of these, a small number of life is possible, and most of them, there couldn't be any life at all. And well, maybe there's 10 to the 500 different kinds of universes. So that, and the one that makes the most sense to me is a theory called it the multiverse. And you can think of our universe as part of a bead on an infinite string of beads, and each of these is a different universe. It doesn't have any direct contact with the other universes, but one of them, like I said earlier, could eventually disappear into a black hole, and all the information becomes the seed of a new universe that's created from that. But like I said about time, it's so hard to get beyond our usual way of conditioned way of thinking about time. So we think of this multiverse as just evolving in this one direction. Well, it would have to be evolving in multiple times that are past, present, and future to us. And there's no, I went to Caltech my freshman year, and the one question I asked early on in the freshman physics class, because they were talking about the theory of relativity, and they were saying that there is no universal time. So like on Star Trek, well, universal time, so-and-so, but Einstein basically showed that's impossible. But something to me, well, that doesn't seem right. Surely there'd be some way you could compensate for this one's moving this way and that way, but I got the explanation, no, there really isn't. So there's no preferred frame of reference. Problem is, each of us thinks our frame of reference is the preferred one, and maybe more of a difficulty than that is we think it's the right one. Or sometimes we think, in the case of some political candidates, the only one. But it's a vantage point. So something that some of you have heard me say before, there was this great Sufi mystic, I think one of the greatest mystics that's ever lived, named Ibn Arabi, that lived in the 11 and 1200s. And one of the things he said was that every soul has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has, can, or will have access to. And further, he said something very radical, not just for his time, but to be considered pretty radical now, is that he said God told the Prophet Muhammad that Muhammad needed to study from his followers because each of them had aspects of access to an aspect of the divine wisdom that he didn't have access to. So the way that I, usually in the past have thought about these awakened beings or great messengers, well, they've got the whole kit and caboodle, especially who's the ultimate one? Buddha. Buddha had the final enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, and he saw the nature of existence in every realm, in the past lives, and this and that, and beyond all the realms, beyond all name and form. And you think if you could just take a Buddha pill and get to the same state as the Buddha, you'd have the same experience. Well, no, you would not have the same experience, because you have access, whether you want to call it divine wisdom or whatever you want to call it, you have access from your unique way of relationship with the rest of the totality that you're an integral part of that no one else has access to or could. And so there's a wisdom that can only come through your unfoldment. And then I also used to think of, some of you may have heard of this idea of the Akashic Records. It's kind of like this library, only it's harder to check books out of. It's the cosmic library that has all the information past, present, and future. And it's alluded to in some scriptures, like in Judaism, the Book of Life. it's written. And in some traditions, well, it's already carved in stone the way everything is going to be. God is omniscient and has the knowledge of everything past, present, or future. Well, to me, in a meaningful universe and a meaningful spirituality, that's an impossibility, because I believe in a universe in which there's always an evolution of wisdom. And the wisdom, the Sufis talk about, the wisdom that emerges is a result of the relationship between the human and the divine. And the Sufis say that each of us is a human hyphen divine being. There's this term called bi-unity. And that the wisdom that accrues is because of what's gained by the divine through our experience and manifestation, that we certainly gain from that, but the divine gains something, a mode of knowing that couldn't come, and this is kind of mind-boggling from traditional notions of what God is about, that what's unfolding through the wisdom gained through your experience that's fed back to the totality couldn't possibly have been known by the way that you think of God when you were created, or even what's going on, because that would imply this static reality that's unaffected by what happens in existence. And it also, to me, would imply a lack of purpose for existence if the only purpose was to get out of it and just dissolve back into the one. Well, this would be like the universe dissolves in the black hole and now there's a new one, but nothing's carried over. And that just somehow is deeply unsatisfying to me. So I'm going to be kind of tying in things from science and mysticism that more go in that direction, that we are all a part of the evolution of the divine being, and we are all unique parts of that divine being. And the aim is not to eliminate our individuality or to get to someplace else, but really everything that we're seeking to understand and experience has been here all along, but the here that we usually find ourselves in is like the shadow in Plato's cave, not because it's up there someplace in the highest heavens, but because our perception has been limited to that of our sensory organs. Our thinking has been limited to the conditioned way of thinking that we have, and the same thing with our emotions and the conditioning of personality. And it's possible to free ourselves from that vantage point, not to dissolve it, but to upgrade it. One of the books that I've written, some of you know about, is called Upgrading the Operating System of the Soul. And really, if I was going to give a contemporary definition of the purpose of spirituality, I would call it that, upgrading the operating system of the soul, to become more and more capable of consciously participating in the divine reality that we're all a part of. So now I have a few minutes left, so I'd like to see if there's any thoughts or questions. Yes?
Will you touch on the Christ consciousness and the pineal gland and
I'm not really going to get much into the physiology. There's a lot of good books written on the physiological changes in the brain that take place with higher states of meditation. In fact, there in the past were some attempts to measure the brain waves of experienced monks and have people do biofeedback to get their brains in the same state. And no, I'm sorry, that's just not going to do the trick. I mean, that's kind of a shadow over what's really going on a much deeper level. And just in brief to your question, there are mystical states that people have reached, sometimes through seizure disorders or even stimulation of certain parts of the brain, and certainly through psychedelic drug experiences. But I think at least I'm wanting a spirituality that goes with science that doesn't require any artificial ingredients, like an organic one. So, any other thoughts or questions? Okay.